Okay, thank you everyone for coming. We're gonna be talking about entities in Drupal 8. My name is Maria Comas. I'm originally from Barcelona, but I'm working at a Major Labs in Austin, Texas. We're going to be talking about why do we care. Maybe we're not backend developers. We're not ever going to be coding and using the entity API. But even if we don't do that, it's important to know the terminology to be able to talk about things. And we're going to see why that's important. We're going to see which concepts are there that matter the most for us. And we'll also see how we create a content entity type if we had to. So this word here means a look shared by two people, each wishing that the other would initiate something that they both desire, but which neither wants to begin. And this is to say that sometimes if you have a word for something, it's easier to recognize that situation or that concept. And it's also easy to talk about it, to express that, to communicate with other people about it, and to think of other ways that could be applied. And it's also that you can get by not knowing any of that stuff, but once you know, you're going to start seeing it everywhere, and things are going to start to make sense. It's something similar to what happens when you break your arm, or you get pregnant, or someone close to you does. You start seeing people with broken arms everywhere, or pregnant women everywhere. And yeah, this is what happened to me. I didn't know any of those words. I thought I know what a node was, and that was mostly it. But then one day, I think it was when I wanted to, I was installing the contact storage module to deal with contact forms, and I think that's in core now, but that module gave you a field to set the redirect after submitting a message in a contact form. And it said in help text that you could use the entity. Then I think it's somewhere in there. You could use the entity and then the bundle name, and then you could set that path. And I didn't know which entity type was the thing I wanted to redirect to. So I started noticing that these words, entity, entity type, bundle, were everywhere. And these are some examples, and we're going to see a few with more detail. The most relevant place where we'll find this probably is when you create a field that is a reference to an entity. And you see that you can select from content, file, image, and this other section gives you all those options to the right. And you don't even realize maybe that that's a reference to an entity because you don't need to. But once you have set it, you can see that it's an entity reference. But you might not know which things are entities. So if you know, you would be able to say, okay, that's what I need. I'm going to make an entity, I'm going to make a reference to a user, and I can do that because users are entities. Then you'll also see that in many modules. This is the rabbit hole module, and when you read the description for that module, you can see that you can configure rabbit hole per entity and per bundle. And if those words don't mean anything to you, you don't know if that's going to solve your problem. And once it's installed, the same thing, you're configuring the settings for that module, and you see that these terms are showing up, are appearing again and again. And this is another example. This Slack, it's very useful. It's full of people that know a lot about Twig and other front-end stuff. and they are helping each other. And this thing came up. Someone wanted a very specific template, or they wanted to pre-process it. Any case, and somebody said, oh, this is the pattern that you can use for that. And you can see, again, we have entity type, we have field name, we have bundle. We might know which field name we want to pre-process, but what about bundle or entity type? And the other thing is that if you are more familiar with these terms, it's going to be helpful to configure what you already have. But also when you are searching for solutions or for answers to problems you might have, if you use the correct words, it's more likely you'll find answers. And this is just modules that have the entity word. And you can see that in 4 or 5 days, 11 more modules were created, were available that had to do with entities. So maybe you have a problem and you don't know how to express that. What you want is something that helps you select, like you have a field type, which is a reference to an entity, and you want your editors to select from your entities in an easier way. Well, there's an entity browser module, but you might be searching for select node or something like that, and you might not come up with that module. So hopefully we want to know what terms are there that might be helpful, that have to do with the entity API. Let's see. So these are not entities, but I thought it might be helpful before diving into Drupal to make an analogy with animals. We have the concept animal, and we know that there are many different kinds of animals. We can see 3 different categories here, and we can see that they all share some characteristics, some properties. Like, we'll say all of them have a name, all of them were born in a specific day, but only koalas have big ears, not whale sharks. So we can see that all animals share some properties, but then they also have some specific to their category. The other thing is that we can talk about animals in general, the concept itself, but we can also talk about a specific animal, like Matthew. He's an animal, but he's Matthew, he's not another animal. And this might seem silly, but sometimes it gets confusing when talking about nodes. And we have other kinds of things. We could say that we have plants, and the same thing we saw, and they all share some properties, and they all have some properties that are specific to their category. And 2 categories can share property, like oaks and poison ivy, they both have leaves. Okay, so let's talk Drupal. Similarly, we have nodes. We could say the analogy was with animals. And then we have these categories. Basic pages and articles are the ones we have by default in a Drupal install. And events could be one that we've created. So all nodes will share some properties, some fields, like title, the user ID, the author, and then we'll define some properties, some fields per each content type. And this is where Matthew comes in. Like, we can talk about nodes, the concept, the base thing, and then we can talk about specific nodes. So the general concept would be the entity type, but many times we might only say entity, because saying entity type every time gets it's too much sometimes. And you can talk about entities, and you are making a reference to a specific entity. So if we check the code, we can see that when the node is defined, we can see that it's using this content entity base class that it's extending, and we'll see that that's the case for all content entities. That's what defines them, that they are using this base class that with what they get some methods and some properties. So we can see that these are nodes. We set the ID to be a node, and then we can see that this bundle label is content type. So these categories we have that share some properties are bundles or types. In the UI, mostly what we see is type, not bundle, but sometimes you still see bundle, like in Drupal 7 paragraphs, I think it was paragraph bundles, not paragraph types, but it's the same thing. And then we said that all nodes are going to share some fields. These are called base fields or properties. I think in Drupal 7 they were called properties, or if, well, sometimes are called attributes, the same concept. We're going to say they are base fields. And these are the fields that all entities that are this entity type, all nodes are going to have. And you can see that these are defined in code. We have the title, we have the UID here, but there are a few more. And each entity type will have their own base fields defined. And then we have these fields that belong to each bundle type or category, which are the configurable fields or bundle fields. And like we saw with oaks and poison ivies, they can be shared across content types. You can have tags field in articles, but you might want that in events too, and that's fine. And there are other things that are not nodes in Drupal. That's what I learned. And we have taxonomy terms, is another entity type, content entity type that we use all the time. All terms are going to share some properties too, like the term ID, name, and some other fields. And then we have also configurable fields you can add to each vocabulary. So same as before, we see that this term is extending the content entity base class. And we can see that it defines the bundle label as vocabularies. So term times, instead of saying term types, we say vocabularies, but it's the same concept we had with nodes. What content types are to nodes is the same vocabularies are to taxonomy terms. And again, we can see base field definitions for the term ID in this case and the name, and there are a few more. So what other content entity types are there in Drupal? There are more than this. These are 4, and we deal with the most maybe. We also have contact messages being content entity types. But let's talk about these 4. Nodes and taxonomy terms we already saw, and also comments and blogs are content entity types. And we see that the bundle name is usually called blog type, comment type, but for taxonomy terms it's a bit different and it's called vocabulary. But this shouldn't be a surprise, because when you are dealing with this site building, you can see that the options you have, the functionality is very similar. We can see here, this is when you want to add a new type of a new bundle for any of these entity types. This is how it looks like, and we can see it's very similar. You can add content type, you can add a vocabulary, you can add a custom blog type, and then we'll be able to manage fields, we'll be able to manage display, to manage form display. So all of that is being provided by the entity API. And we also have these views to list all the entities, all the instances we have for that entity type. Content, we can see tags is vocabulary. Here, they are a bit different terms than content, comments, and blogs, but it's the same concept. You have this list, and you can create a new instance of that entity type. So I've been talking about entity types, and sometimes I said content entity types, and maybe sometimes I didn't. So why is that? We not only have content entity types in Drupal, we also have config entity types in Drupal 8. And they come from the same entity API. They share same interface, but there are some differences. All of them are create entities, and entities you can load, you can store. But for content entity types, we store them in the database. They are fillable, you can add fields to them. Not for all of them, but mostly you will. And they have to do about to how you structure your content, how you model your content. And config entity types, config entities have to do with how your system, how your application works. But we can see that they are both extending this entity class. And examples of config entity types would be views and blocks, as we see. Blocks might be confusing because we have the block config entity type and the block content entity type. And the content entity type is actually called block content. If you check the code, you'll see that there are two modules. One is block content and the other one is block. Other examples could be image styles, menus, fields. All of those are config entities. Also bundles. So content types, vocabularies, all of those are config entities. Okay, so yeah, now let's imagine that our content doesn't fit into one of the content entity types that we have available in Drupal 8. So what do we do? If we wanted to create a custom content entity type, which we should if we cannot use one that's already available, because if you do, you'll get all that stuff that Drupal is already providing and you don't need to code that again. We have different options. We can see that many modules to that. As we saw, there are many modules that work with entities and that leverage the entity API. And here are three examples. This poll module, we also have the media entity module, and the paragraph module. Paragraphs is an awesome module. Probably most of you have already worked with it. And what they do is create an entity type, as we can see. They define the ID, same thing we saw for nodes or taxonomy terms. And if you are curious, you can see the structure there. That's where you'll find the definition of that entity type. So if you want to create one, one thing you can do is write your code from scratch. And if you want to do that, one good starting point is this examples module. They have all kinds of different examples, and there's one for config entity types and there's one for content entity types. And it's very cool because you can see that they explain why they do what they do. Other things that might help is this content entity base module. I haven't used it, but I saw that the goal was to provide this common code that all content entity types that want to have bundles will use, probably. And there's also Drupal console that has a command to generate content entity types, also config. Another way is if coding it is not what the route you want to go, you can also do that by a site building, only using the UI. You don't need to code that. There's this entity construction kit module that's very, very cool, that allows you to create your own custom content entity types. So you can see that we can add an entity type. We can then define from these base fields. So if you needed other base fields, you would probably want to code that yourself. And when you have bundles, you can do the same. You would deal with content types or block types. You can add fields, you can have different view modes, you can configure, you can do all the same good things you can do with content types or other types. And this navigating to your content here might get a bit cumbersome. So This is usually used in conjunction with this other module, Inline Entity Form module, and this other module you can use with nodes. You don't need to, it's not only for custom content entity types. And this is very cool. What this does is that if you have, here we have a Ben that has a field that's a reference to instruments. And these are nodes, these are not even custom content entity types. So what you can do is you can edit or create your nodes, in this case, right there, right when you are editing or creating a parent, a Ben, in this case. And you can also configure that so it's like you want it. There are many options. You can set it so you can only create new ones, or you can set it so you can browse the existing ones and select one. So it's very easy to reuse these entities you might have in different entities, because you can search for them and you can edit them, and you don't need to go through all the menu and find, list, edit, all that. So that's mostly it. We're gonna see just that there are a few links here for documentation. It's good and it's getting even better, the documentation for entities in Drupal.org. And also I wanted to just mention these other modules that have to do with entities. The first two is what we saw, the entity construction kit and the inline entity form. But you can embed entities in WYSIWYGs, you can browse and select entities to make it easier for your editors. You have this media entity, which other modules use for images and all kinds of media things. And you have external entities if you want to use content that doesn't live in your database. And you have this dynamic entity reference that allows you to create a field that references that it can reference more than one entity type. So you could create a field that's a reference to nodes or terms or whatever content entity type you need. So that's it. Thank you for coming and listening to me. There are any comments or questions?
So in one of your earlier slides, you had there's the entity type and there's the entities.
Yes.
And then you went to the next slide and the word entities changed to bundles. So what's the difference between entities and bundles? It seemed like, are they synonymous? Are they different?
They are different. This one. This,
yeah, so entities and then...
Yeah. So the entity would be your node that has an ID.
The actual instance itself.
Exactly,
Okay.
your instance. And the bundle is is that grouping that allows us to say, okay, all these entities are going to have these same fields, these configurable fields, like your article that has a body field, that has a tags field, whatever. So the bundle is that grouping fields that allows you to create an entity, the instance, that already has all that. Because if not, you would have to set to have many entity types, and maybe they all share the same base fields, and that allows us to not have to do that all the time.
So is it in a way a bundle from previous Drupal versions the same thing as a content type? Like a bundle and a content type?
It's exactly the same.
Okay.
But bundle is the generic term.
Okay.
So content types is only for nodes,
Right. Okay.
but then vocabulary is the same for terms, or block types is the same for blocks. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you found it confusing at all. I did when I went from Drupal 6 to 7 and said, well, we're going to have bundles down. Okay. And Drupal 7 came out and you go into the admin interface and it doesn't mention bundle anywhere. It's still, everywhere you go, it's still talking about content types. And you go looking for the word bundle because there's a whole big thing that we're going to switch to bundles and not to be seen anymore.
Yeah, well, I have to say that my experience with Drupal is mostly Drupal 8. So I've been reading about the history of entities in Drupal in general, but I never worked with Drupal 6, so I don't know about that. But it is true that sometimes it's confusing, like bundle versus type, or content instead of node. why is my term not content if it has fields, it has content? It might be confusing, yeah.
So I think you may have just explained it, so I do apologize, I'm going to ask you to explain it again. But I'm still, despite all the great explanation, I'm still having trouble differentiating between a content type and an entity. What in specific makes them different?
Bundle and entity?
No, yes, I'm
Which
sorry,
ones?
content type and entity.
Content type and bundle property.
They're not the same thing. I mean, the comparison would be like from a node to an entity. A content type is a grouping of nodes. A bundle is a grouping of entities. And bundles are really useful when you're building programmatic interactions in content. So, yeah, I mean, this would be a presentation to go through.
Entity versus field
Yeah.
probably is something which we can discuss.
Pardon?
What is entity and what is a field?
A field is a part of an entity. Entities are made up of fields, and bundles are made up of entities.
That's a bundle. So it's the subtype of the entity and the subtype.
The big reason for the difference is that you can build things that aren't really content types or normal content out of entities. So once again, I'm just drawing a blank for examples, but content, obviously anything can be an entity. Taxonomy can be an entity. You can build a bundle of taxonomy, so it wouldn't be equivalent to a content type. It'd be something very different. Or users, yes, users are entities, and you can build entities that are not taxonomy, content, or users. You can build entities that are something totally different. I
Yeah.
can show you an example, but it would take me.
Content type versus entity. The content type is usually applied only to nodes. And a node is type of an entity,
But
right?
not exactly.
So like node as a concept, not individual nodes, but node as a concept is an entity type. Within that entity type, you can have specific subtypes such as articles, basic pages. Those are content types. Within that, a specific basic page, a specific article, that would be an entity.
Exactly, yeah.
Does that explain it?
Yeah,
But
it's not incorrect.
It can get more complicated as you look at different types of entities, but that's the basic concept.
Yeah, like if you have worked with rabbit hole, you can say, I want this specific entity, this specific page to redirect to this other page. Or you can say, I want all articles, all basic pages to redirect to that other page. So if you are saying, I want all of them to redirect, you are configuring it per bundle. You are saying all entities that belong to this bundle, I want them to redirect to this other page. But if you only want this specific page, this specific entity to redirect, that's where you say this entity is gonna redirect.
Oh.
Or for blocks, you can create a block type, and you have this header block type that has an image, has a title, and then you create as many as you want blocks that are that type of block. So those would be your entities, and the block type would be your content type, would be your bundle, your
I
block
think I
type.
got it.
Yeah.
If I'm creating new content type for a node, I can see from your presentation that there are different ways to create it. I can create it via web interface and then export it. I can build it programmatically based on like some examples, right?
Well, not exactly. If you want to create content types, so you're going to have nodes,
Yeah.
you're going to use the UI. What I was talking about with these other options was if you want to create an entity type that's not a node. Like paragraphs too. paragraphs are not nodes, are not taxonomy terms, are not blocks. It's another type of entity that they create from scratch.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the word.
Paragraphs.
Paragraphs?
Yes.
I can configure them via web interface as well.
Yeah, but if you see the code, they created a new entity type. So if you wanted to create a new custom content entity that is not a node, is not a term, is not any of the ones Drupal gives you or a country module gives you, that's when you might do it coding from scratch, or you might use this entity construction kit if you want to do it only site building, UI, no code.
But for building new content type, I'll be better off doing it from web interface and then exporting.
Well, content types are part of the old legacy node system. So there's all sorts of web-based tools. There's nothing in Drupal core to build entities. You can either build it by coding, or you can use the entity construction kit, which provides an analog to the tools for nodes and content types to do it that way. But of course, building it in code is much more flexible.
Yeah, but if you want a new content type, is because you want all the things Node have, like sticky to the front page, published, not published. If you want to have all that functionality, then you're going to use a new content type. But maybe you want something that's completely different from that, and then you need a new custom content entity type.
So I have now flexibility to do completely new, and it's my choice now with the system architecture to either do content type for the node or do a completely different.
Yeah, you can go one level up and say, I'm going to create a new content entity type.
So here's an example. You could create entity type for users. So you could create different types of users, just like a content type, using bundles to bundle those user types. I can't tell you exactly how you use this, but you could do that.
The difference is, though, if you create a new entity, you have to also provide the services for that entity.
Sure.
Right? If you don't use a node, then all the things that Drupal's doing for you to maintain that node, it's not going to do for your new entity.
But users aren't nodes, just like
But
that.
Drupal also does it for
Yeah.
users.
Right.
But if you create a brand new entity, Drupal's not doing anything for you except create the entity.
Well, yeah, but you can also, maybe you want something that's similar to an entity type that Drupal gives you, but it's not the same. And then you can work from that. You can have that as a base and then change it as you need to. And all the functionality that's there, you can use. Or you can just grab some from other entity types. If you want to have a parent for that entity type, terms do that, or comments do that. So you can go there and see how they do it and do it for your custom entity
Or like
type.
you said, use the example model.
Yeah. Yeah, they create a contact entity type, which has a reference to a user and some other things. So that could be a use case where you want to create your own custom content entity type.
So if you create your own entity type, what do you get? Do you get a user interface? Do you get the storage system? Can you use it with views?
Yeah, you can get all that. It depends on how you do it. But potentially you have all that available to you. If you use the UI instead of coding it, it's more limited, of course.
Okay.
You get the forms to edit, to create, to delete entities. But if that's not what you want, you can just follow how other content entity types do it, or just go to the documentation and you'll see. It's pretty, I mean, I haven't done anything weird, but you can go there and read, and it's pretty explanatory how you define the table where you're gonna store your content. You define if you wanna use there are handlers where you say, okay, I want to be able to list all of them, all my entities. I want to be able to delete them. I want to be able to use them via UI or not. Maybe you don't want that. You can also set that. There's a, I don't know. Well, I don't see it here, but all these options is where you define if you want the content entity type to be fillable, or if you want it to be configurable with a form via UI. That's where you say all the stuff.
So all the stuff in the annotations?
Yeah, and then also methods, but then the annotation is the first place you want to go and set all that stuff.
Is there a big document that lists all the annotation preferences and stuff for entities?
Yeah, I think if you go to the first one, Introduction to Entities, there you can find a section for annotations that tells you all the options.
Thank you.
You have your slides available?
Not yet, but they will be on this session page. I think that's it. Thank you very much.